Gonna be honest with you all, I've never been big into the Soulsborne games. I've played a few of them, but I've never beaten them myself. I just couldn't get into them enough to really want to play through the entirety of each game. Got about halfway through Demon's Souls, a third of the way through the original Dark Souls. I played Bloodborne until just after Gascoigne. Yes, I know I gave up real early on that one. But they just didn't click with me. While I understand their appeal, why so many people enjoy them, I didn't really think they were for me, and it kept me from wanting to really dip my toe into the wider world of Souls-like games for a long time. And then I played Sekiro. Now, to be fair, there are a lot of differences between the Soulsborne games and Sekiro, such as the lack of emphasis on RPG mechanics, its faster gameplay style, its near mandatory recommendation for stealthy gameplay, and mastering split-second parrying. But it does still retain enough of its traditional difficulty and ideas of past FromSoft games that I feel the comparison still holds water. I played it, and I loved it, and I actually was tenacious enough to beat that game, and it felt really damn good. And I finally felt like it clicked for me too, so I decided to head back and maybe try some of the other Souls-style games that I had given a pass on when they were new, even if I was interested in them at the time. Enter Nioh, developed by Team Ninja, the same studio responsible for the Dead or Alive series, and a smattering of hack-and-slash and fighting games outside of that, like Hyrule and Fire Emblem Warriors, and even the Final Fantasy Dissidia games. And of course, Nioh was going to appeal to me. It's basically a Dark Souls game taking place in feudal Japan, to the point where its backdrop is during an actual historical event and almost every character featured was a real person in history, though obviously greatly exaggerated and altered for the purposes of the story. Set in 1600 during the Sengoku era of Japan, in a world where a mystical mineral known as Amrita exists, and particularly powerful people are protected by guardian spirits, otherworldly beings brought into existence through human thought and belief, a pirate named William Adams manages to escape execution in the Tower of London, but in the process, his guardian spirit, Saoirse, is stolen from him by a man named Edward Kelly. William chases Edward all the way to the islands of Japan to get her back, and lands on its shores just as it's reaching the peak of a war between Mitsuhide Ishida and Ieyasu Tokugawa for total control over Japan. With the war raging on, demons have started to cross over from another realm, with many human spirits coming back to take the form of monsters. As Edward Kelly allies himself with Ishida in hopes of eventually resurrecting Oda Nobunaga to try and keep the war going on perpetually to generate more and more Amrita, William aligns himself with the forces of Tokugawa, particularly the ninja master Hattori Hanzo, in hopes of driving back the yokai, ending the war, and getting his spirit back. The story is pretty good, but I'll just say now that if you aren't a big history buff, you might be a little confused by all of these different minor characters that show up through the story. Yes, it's a very fictional retelling of real-life events with some over-the-top action, magic, and mythical beasts, but a lot of characters and events are referred to very casually, which can lead to a bit of confusion here or there. But the main plot itself is easy enough to understand. While having a good idea of the historical backdrop of the game can enhance it, it's not necessary to know a lot about Sengoku-era Japan in order to understand William's quest, as it is kept very personal, with the war sort of a background event that he just happens to be dragged into. And if you are someone with a wealth of knowledge of this period in history and its major players, you're either going to appreciate the liberties that were taken to try and show some of these people as being more three-dimensional than how they're often portrayed in the history books, or you are absolutely going to hate it for not depicting history closer to what really happened, which, I remind you, magical demons and guardian beasts. While the game does use the broad strokes of history as its backdrop, it's not particularly interested in accurately portraying certain events, which I think serves it well. You do find a lot of good environmental storytelling in the game too, much like in the original Souls games, as there's a lot of incidental dialogue as you hear the memories and final moments of many of the corpses you check for items and weapons throughout the game. And many of the mission splash screens give you brief blurbs about the important history of the place you're entering. mostly how it pertains to the present goings-on. As for characters, well, there are a lot of them, but no one's really given a chance to leave a huge impression. Apart from Kelly as the recurring antagonist, there are few that manage to stand out in the crowd, mostly because we don't spend a lot of time focusing on each individual character, and a majority of their motivation is spelled out when they gift you their guardian spirit, or when their guardian spirit goes to you. Even our main character, William, who is an actual character in the story as opposed to a blank slate you create during the start of the game, doesn't really have much of a personality of his own, and in many scenes remains entirely silent for the duration of conversations with other characters, despite being magically gifted the ability to understand their language. They do their job, but characterization here is kept to a pretty big minimum, though you do get to see some monologues from certain characters through their guardian spirits, like I said, that does give them a bit more depth and intrigue, though most often seeing a character's guardian spirit scene also means that their importance to William's quest, and therefore the overarching story, has come to an end, with a few exceptions. But hey, while I did enjoy the story, that wasn't really what kept me hooked on this game. The gameplay was. Nioh does hold on to the typical Soulsborne structure when it comes to combat. You need to try and avoid fighting too many enemies at once because it's very easy for even the weakest enemies, even late in the game, to kill you in a few well-placed hits. And you need to bait enemies into attacking, rush in, deal some damage, and rush out before they have a chance to counter. You'll be fighting the same sort of enemies over the entire game with the exception of the bosses, though some of them do come back later, so learning how each enemy operates, what sort of attacks they use, and when to strike at them, and with what, is very crucial to survival. Your enemies are basically divided into two different groups. You have humans, and you have yokai. Human enemies operate on the same sort of rules that you do. Every attack that you or they use will drain their ki meter, this game's version of stamina. If your ki gets too low, you can't dash or attack, and if you try blocking without any ki, you can be staggered. You can also be staggered if you take an unguarded hit with very little ki in the meter as well, during which time you're wide open for enemies to get in a lot of damage, or even a finishing blow if you're really unlucky. Conversely though, you can do the same to human enemies. Yokai operate a little differently. Yokai are generally more sturdy, bigger, and harder to stagger than humans, and their ki only drains when they're attacked. However, they don't naturally regain ki the way that humans do. Instead, they can only gain ki by summoning yokai energy clouds, these swirling black and gray puddles on the ground. If you stand in one, it slows down your own ki recovery, though you can get rid of them by performing a ki burst at the end of an attack. Ki bursts can also restore some of your lost ki faster, but the window for a burst is just long enough after an attack to give a particularly quick enemy an opening to land a strike or two. While most human enemies operate similarly, with some of the more skilled enemies being particularly good at mimicking the maneuvers that you or another player would be capable of, making them far more dangerous, and fights with humans who have guardian spirits also have an added wrinkle to it in that they can often tap into the power of that spirit and use special maneuvers, often incorporating elemental damage into their attacks. But yokai? There's a huge variety of monstrous creatures you'll have to fight against, from the basic skeleton warriors, who are basically slower but slightly more powerful humans, through common oni, giant cyclopses, fiery wheel monks, long-tongued ogres, giant spiders, tengu, I freaking hate tengu, kitsune, and even rage-filled biwa players. And to assist you in this effort, William has a very impressive arsenal of both attack and defense options. You have 5 different forms of weapons, 7 if you bought DLC, and each of them operates slightly different from one another. Swords are good all-around weapons, axes are really slow but hit a lot harder, spears have a great reach but can smack against walls really easily, dual swords are all about a little damage but lots of hits, and kusarigama are great for keeping enemies at a distance and controlling the battlefield, but they can also drain your ki really quickly. Add to it, each weapon has a light attack and a strong attack, and 3 different stances that drastically change how the weapon behaves. High stance is all about powerful attacks, but your movements require more wind-up, and attacks can take more time, making it tougher to dodge or block. Mid stance is more defensive, enhancing your block and letting you keep enemies at range, and low stance is focused on evasion. You don't cause much damage per hit, but your attacks are much faster and much easier to dodge out of. Big surprise, I ended up using low stance more than anything else in this game. You can also use samurai points you accrue to learn new techniques for your weapons that have new properties to increase your effectiveness in combat, like knocking enemies down, drawing them in from a distance, following up a block or a dodge with a counterattack, and a ton of other stuff. You can also get special passive abilities from upgrading a weapon's abilities, like increased damage against certain enemies, or in specific situations, though they only apply to that particular weapon. Each weapon is also associated with a particular stat as well, so when you decide to focus on a particular weapon, you basically have to keep in mind which stat it's associated with, because that's probably the one you'll want to buff most often when you level up, though you'll have to pay attention to other stats as well for reasons I'll get into in a bit. Aside from the melee weapons, of which you can hold 2 at once and switch between at any time, you can also hold 2 ranged weapons, choosing from bows, rifles, or hand cannons, and have a shortcut menu that lets you equip up to 4 items to use at once, though you can also eventually upgrade to up to 4 shortcut menus, letting you equip up to 16 items whenever you want. Oh, and then you can also learn ninjutsu and onmyo magic, which lets you equip weapons and magic to buff yourself, debuff your enemies, attack them from afar with things like kunai, shuriken, blinding powder, various elemental projectile spells, and the almighty sloth and weakness talismans, among many other things. These things are invaluable and are also tied to their own stats, which you can increase as you level up to increase their effectiveness and eventually take on special dojo missions that will give you access to more options or increase the amount of old options you had as well. And above everything else that you have, there's your ace in the hole, the living weapon mode, calling on the power of your currently equipped guardian spirit to make you completely invincible for a brief period of time, where you can dish out a huge amount of damage, but the more you attack and the more damage you take in this state, the quicker the meter drains, and how effective this mode is not only determined by your spirit stat, but which spirit you have equipped at the time, of which you gain a huge amount over the course of the story, and by finishing side missions, each spirit offering their own particular bonuses when they're equipped. If all of this sounds overwhelming, it kind of is, especially during your first run-through, and that's not even talking about the armor system, which requires you to have a minimum amount of particular stats, which might not be stats that you're actively interested in increasing, in order to activate the special abilities and power that the armor offers. Some armor even offers special bonuses if you wear an entire matching set, so you really have to think about what armor you're wearing and what stats you want to increase in order to reap the most benefits from them. That, combined with the weight of armor, which will affect bonuses as well. For example, if you're wearing armor that's too heavy for you, it can damage your dodging ability. And all of this leads to something that's really overwhelming at first, but very rewarding when you get the hang of it. Nioh basically encourages you to build a character just how you want to play them, and it gives you plenty of options for how you want to do that. My personal favorite build is one that focuses more on ranged combat and magic, so I chose the Kusarigama as my main weapon, which just so happened to be tied to the same stat as ninjutsu, making that more effective, and I also focused on increasing my onmyo magic stat as well, giving me access to some very powerful spells, including ones that, if I'm being honest, kind of trivialized a lot of the later game. Seriously, if you get the Sloth and Weakness talismans, even if you don't focus on any other forms of magic, you can steamroll a lot of boss fights and tougher enemy encounters by cutting their speed and defense in half, and then just wailing on them. Add to it a lot of bonuses that increased my ranged weapon and projectile abilities, meaning I could stealth kill a lot of enemies before getting close to them, or finish off dangerous enemies from afar with things like kunai without having to risk getting in closer for the final blow. A strategy that, as it turns out, actually led to me completely decimating the final boss, which is made much easier if you have a lot of distance options available to you. The game also encourages you to experiment by giving you a chance to earn titles. You earn a lot of these just by playing the game normally, like defeating a certain number of one type of enemy, or using a certain weapon or technique enough, or by causing enough elemental damage, though some of them you do have to go out of your way for. By earning titles, you earn reputation points, which allow you to attain permanent buffs for your character to stay with you always. They start out very small, like a single point of toughness, or 0.5% more effectiveness from healing items, but as the game goes on and you drop more and more points into each of these, the bonuses really start to add up. And since you can get so many titles right at the start of the game, it's easy to end up getting a lot of these bonuses one right after the other. But that's just all of the mechanics, but does the game actually play well? Well, rather than going for a typical Souls game setup of having you explore a single, vast, open, interconnected world, instead, it focuses on a mission structure. Between missions, you can hang out here on the map screen, where you can freely change around your equipment, visit the shrine, improve your stuff at the forge, either by leveling up existing equipment or forging new equipment, or by going to the dojo to take on special missions to gain access to more abilities as the game goes on. From there, you can select various main missions that will advance the plot, or sub-missions that often take place in small, walled-off areas, or areas of one of the environments from the main mission. While the sub-missions are often pretty short to complete, often only requiring you to hunt down and kill a particular enemy or group of enemies in a short path, the main missions can take much longer. When you get real good at them and know what to expect, it probably won't take you more than, say, 20 to 40 minutes to run through most of them. Maybe a bit longer if you're really exploring the place, looking for all of the various treasure chests and Kodama spirits that are strewn throughout each stage. But that's when you actually know the layout. When you don't, hoo boy, it's going to take a while. Mostly because you're probably going to either keep getting ganked or killed and sent back to the last shrine you prayed at, or you're going to be inching your way along really slowly thinking there's going to be an enemy around every single corner. Which, to be fair, more often than not, there is. Some of these stages can also be particularly annoying and winding, especially later ones. The Iga Mansion and Ishida's Castle are prime examples of this. I had a hell of a time my first time through these stages, just trying to navigate them and keep track of where I was and where I was going. When you die, and you will die, and die often, you lose any Amrita you had on you at the time, basically all of your experience points, and you lose access to your guardian spirit. A grave will appear at the point where you died, and if you die a second time without reclaiming your grave, or using a summoner's candle to recall the spirit to you, you'll permanently lose all of your experience points, and any living weapon energy you had built up drops to 0 as well, which definitely does make you feel like there's a lot of tension for playing carelessly or getting overconfident, especially against the bosses. The levels themselves all have a good variety to them in terms of their environments and layouts. While the entire world might not be interconnected, the missions are pretty wide open and sprawling, and there's often a lot to explore in each one, though the various pathways are usually either short paths that will take you to a hidden rare item or treasure chest, or forking paths that will all lead to the same place, but often providing different advantages and disadvantages, such as offering you a quick but more dangerous route, as opposed to a longer route but with less powerful enemies. You can even see that as early as the first level, which technically has 2 different paths to take, though not really because you'll probably die if you take one of them. When you reach this gate here, you can technically go through it and skip having to go around the cliffside to reach the fishing village, but you'll have to take on a huge group of like 6 human goons all at once. And this early in the game, and even later in the game, taking on that many enemies at once is basically a death sentence. But if you go the long way around, while there are more enemies, They're spread out and can be picked off one by one. And there's even a checkpoint shrine along the way as well, so you don't have to worry about losing all of your progress there. The game is basically teaching you that there may be an easier way to get around certain obstacles, and it's good that it teaches you this lesson early on because it's one that you want to learn as quickly as possible. The various missions all culminate in a boss battle against either a powerful human opponent or a powerful yokai, and pretty much every mission basically boils down to reach the boss room. But how you do so, apart from all the alternate pathways, can sometimes involve secondary objectives, some of which are totally optional. Like this one here, taking place at a flooded harbor temple. You can actually run straight to the boss room in a couple of minutes and go straight in, but you'll not only be fighting the boss, but also a bunch of miniature enemies that are incredibly annoying to fight if you don't have things that cause fire damage, and also leaves you vulnerable to the boss's attacks. However, if you take the time to fully explore the level and light the 3 ceremonial torches, 3 bonfires will be lit in the boss arena, which will not only burn up the smaller enemies before they can reach the arena, but will also give you a place to light your weapon on fire, which is basically the only way to cause decent damage to this boss if you aren't using something like the Hayato masks, which I did. Or what about this frozen mansion area? The path to the boss door is a little bit winding, but it's otherwise straightforward. But because there are these big ice crystals in the way, you have to constantly branch off from the main path and hunt down these spirit butterflies to shatter the ice and move forward. All the while, each mission often has several locked or closed doors that can't be opened until you work your way around to their back and open them from the other side, giving you a handy shortcut if you end up dying and need to quickly make your way back to where you were on the way to bosses. And the bosses, they are both frightening and fun to fight. Most of them can very easily knock all your health out in just 1 or 2 hits, and even the ones that chip your health away are often attacking you so often that it's easy to die in a single combo. And they come in a variety of forms and styles. It does take some observation to learn how each boss operates, what sort of attacks they have, and how to get in close for a quick attack before rushing away. Quite a few bosses were definitely roadblocks for me for a while, though a good reason for that was mostly because I was being stubborn and refusing to vary my own attack patterns. Once I actually started experimenting with other ways of attacking them, or just started regularly using the sloth and weakness talismans, because let's be honest, that strategy is the most overpowered thing in the entire game when faced with single enemies, I finally started to wear them down, and repeated fights against them weren't nearly as difficult as the first. There are few feelings in this game quite like managing to get through a boss on your first try. The controls in this game feel really good. While your default movement speed is a bit on the slow side, you don't really want to be running through places like this too fast anyway, and I find the control to be very responsive. But due to the fact that it's easy to get too overzealous, I find myself doing a lot of panic dodging, which isn't really that smart since dodging doesn't come out of a combo as fast as blocking. But because I went with such a light build during my 2 playthroughs of the game, blocking was never a high priority because I always took so much ki damage from it. I generally found it better to just try to dodge around my opponents rather than try and block them. In the heat of combat, I often find myself forgetting about certain crucial details. There have been a few times I've accidentally switched stances when I didn't mean to, but the major issue is accidentally using an item I didn't mean to in the shortcut menu. While it's very handy having 4 different menus with 4 items each, in the heat of the moment, it can be easy to forget to change to the one you want. I've wasted a lot of spells accidentally when I was trying to use a healing item. It doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it can really make me feel like a moron. Oh, and I really wish that pausing was more convenient. That's a problem I have with Souls and Souls-like games in general, the lack of pausing. I get that the games always want me to feel like I'm in danger, but denying me the ability to easily take a breather feels more annoying than anything else, and here it's no different. You can pause the game, but it feels more tedious than it should because it requires 2 button presses. Pressing the touchpad brings up the menu, but the game is still running, so if you're still fighting, you're still vulnerable. You have to hit the options button while the menu is up to pause the game. And when you do pause the game, if you go back from the pause game, the menu will still be open, which can lead to you accidentally opening up, say, the item menu or the skills customization menu when you are just trying to run away from an enemy or get back into combat. So why can't you just hit the options button to bring up the pause menu? Because it brings up the gestures menu, which is a staple of these sorts of games, mainly meant for wordlessly communicating with other players. Though Nioh does at least give them a purpose beyond that. Certain yokai, specifically the Nerdakabe and the Mujina, can be placated by performing gestures in front of them so you don't have to fight against them. If you gesture in a way that pleases them, then they'll just go on their merry way and leave you a bunch of treasure. But otherwise, the gesture menu basically just robs you of an easy pause button. That is a bit of a nitpick, I admit, but it is something that fairly regularly tripped me up when I first started playing the game. Beyond that though, the game is a joy to play, and the overall speed of combat feels faster and more fluid to me than most of the original Souls games, though the camera can sometimes be an issue. If you get backed into a corner or are in a narrow passageway, the camera does do a decent job of staying on you, but unfortunately there are times when it can get pulled way too far in, resulting in you losing any sort of spatial awareness you had, which can be a big problem in situations when you're forced to fight many foes at once, or are trying to be careful not to get the attention of other nearby enemies while picking them off one by one. The game looks great though, and I appreciate that it gives me the option of what sort of play experience I want from the start, allowing me to choose whether I want the game to play its best or look its best. And look, I'm playing this game on an older vanilla PS4, so I obviously went with favored performance, and I still think that the game looks great. The worst that I noticed was there were times when enemies in the distance would just sort of pop into existence, and if they were far enough away, it would sort of look more like they were animated GIFs trying to load on a slow internet connection. Nothing that ruined the experience, of course, and they looked just fine when I got up close and personal and started whacking them over the head with a great big sickle. Speaking of looking just fine, the detail put into these character models is great too, especially for the yokai. They can look downright horrific at times, some of them bordering on the edge of eldritch horrors. The human characters can look pretty plain, but they definitely come to life in the CG cutscenes. Especially William, who, for a few specific scenes, will always be wearing weapons and armor that you have equipped when he enters the scene. This is another reason why the game encourages you to wear matching sets of armor, because mismatched armor in this game just looks really, really ridiculous. And seeing William in full armor just highlights that fact, though some of them just look silly by design to begin with. I also find it funny when you're wearing masks or anything that covers William's face when he's in certain cutscenes, because it really helps to highlight just how much of a mute statue he is. They do look nice though, and in particular, the scenes introducing bosses that you fight really do a good job of making them look imposing at the very least. The animations are all pretty nice too, which when it comes to enemies is important because every enemy you fight will have some sort of wind-up or tell to what attack they plan on using next, and recognizing those early is the key to fighting smart in this game, alongside understanding your own wind-ups and combining your various attacks and weapons together to try and string together as long a combo as possible. Though I personally mostly just stuck to my basic combo, hit and run dash attacks, and then attacking from afar with ninjutsu and magic. From a sound design angle, yeah, I really like it. It of course used a lot of brass and string instruments for the more desperate or serious fights, but a lot of the instrumentals in the stages themselves are very sparse, if they exist at all, with most of them using atmospheric, natural soundscapes for each area, which sets a very mellow but very foreboding mood, as the only constant that you hear is your own footsteps, so when you get that sudden hiss of an enemy noticing you, you instantly feel tense, anticipating the threat that's coming your way, even when you can see what's coming for you. The combat sounds feel really nice too, which is good because with larger enemies, when you can't stagger them, the crunch and slash sound effects of your weapon impacting them is the only real indication that you're hurting them, apart from the damage numbers appearing. But when you combine the sounds with the animations of enemies you can stagger, it feels really, really good to land a string of hits on them. The voice acting is also pretty good. I'm not the best judge of Japanese voice acting, but the voices themselves all fit the characters and their designs well. Though the characters that speak English also do a pretty good job-ish. There are only a few of them, but the only one that stands out is Edward Kelly, mostly because he's so deliciously evil and over the top whenever he speaks. But everyone else is very soft and bland, William being especially guilty of this. He has quite the brogue to his voice, but he doesn't actually talk very loudly, and with such a gruff tint to his voice, he can actually be kind of hard to understand, which makes me glad that subtitles are on by default in this game. Again, this is a bit of a minor point since character and story isn't really something that's a major driving force in this game so much as the challenges you find in the stages proper. Now, the game did recently get a sequel, Nioh 2, which I have yet to play, but if it keeps a lot of what this game had going for it, I will definitely have to grab myself a copy when I can. I loved this game, and I can't describe the exhilarating thrill I got from it during my first playthrough, and even during my second playthrough, where a lot of this footage comes from. It still felt just as gratifying and rewarding and fun to play through, even when I was much more aware of what was going to happen from stage to stage, and had a much better grasp of how to build my character for the sort of playstyle I was looking for. It just clicked with me in a way that the original Souls games didn't, and I'm glad I found a game in the genre that I can consider my gateway into trying more games like it. If you enjoy Soulsborne-esque games, or liked the original Souls games, you've probably already given this game a try. But if you haven't, copies of it are fairly cheap, and I'd highly recommend it if you're looking for a starting point for the genre. I found the challenge to be high, but very fair, and even when I failed, I felt like I was pushed more towards trying again, rather than just quitting out of frustration. Even if some of the bosses did frustrate me a little bit. Of course, there is a chance that as someone who doesn't have a lot of experience with other games in the genre, I could be recommending a game that others would say is one of the hardest of its kind without actually realizing it. But hey, if that's the case, then if you start at the top, then anything else has to be easier, right? Yeah, I probably don't know what I'm talking about, but I still found the game really fun. I'll see you next time, everyone.